Perfect. So, let me just start off with this and kind of tell you a little bit about what other people have talked about when they talk about coal mining, coal movies. Let's see. Looking at and just trying to get rid of that on my screen. All right. So what you're looking at here, this is some kind of researchers, people who've done more research than I, certainly into portrayals of coal mining. You'll notice most of them focus on Appalachia. That's not a surprise, right? It's certainly been historic home of coal mining through much of the U.S., although certainly not the major producer now, which remains the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, mostly Wyoming. But here's a few people who've done some solid research. A guy named J.W. Williamson is a kind of a cultural critic in this book, Hillbilly Land. Spends most of the time talking about how people in Appalachia, especially those in mining communities, are portrayed as stupid, violent, impoverished. Another common viewpoint, essentially very similar to Williamson, is Alessandro Portelli. In his book, They Say in Harlan County, very similar kinds of discussion, right, about the kind of stereotypes, how a lot of the residents of Appalachian places, especially these coal places, like Harlan County, appear very kind of alien, outside of the modern world, very stereotyped in similar ways to Williamson. This has been challenged a bit recently. John Insko is a historian, in a book named Movie Made Appalachia, reviewed a whole bunch of different movies made about Appalachia, in which he essentially says, well, no, actually, he pushes back. He says, actually, characters in coal communities in most movies are noble. They're very kind of bonded with each other. They care really a lot about their community. They're actually portrayed as fairly smart, unlike what Williamson and Portelli have said. All right, so I thought, well, this is kind of curious. What might I be able to say by looking myself at portrayals of Appalachia in popular culture? So first, what I did is I looked at all those Appalachian coal movies that those people looked at, and then I looked beyond that at largely kind of American-produced movies. And in fact, in the early days, you were as likely to find an American-produced movie about Wales and Welsh coal mining as you might be to find them about Appalachia. And then I started looking at TV. I think especially in the last 20, 30 years, you're more likely to find mining in TV than you are in movies, for all varieties of reasons, most of which just have to do with the fact that there's just more TV being produced than movies right now, than Hollywood movies. So I listed a few themes here on this screen. One about how there's people who care deeply about community, just like Insko says, they have great pride in themselves and their work and in their place. But, right, a lot of those similar themes that Portelli and Williamson said are still there in these mining movies, right? They still emphasize poverty, especially, right? These places are portrayed as being very impoverished. They're kind of driven by class conflict. There's a lot of class conflict in coal movies, actually, unlike most other mining movies where the kind of class conflict, the conflict between workers and the coal companies are not as prominent in other kinds of movies. And just in general, company power is really a major theme of these coal movies, no matter where they're set, right? The coal companies in these places, according to the popular culture, right, control everything, right? These are always very company town places, in kind of the most stereotypical sense. The coal community itself appears dirty, downtrodden, often violent, and I'd argue kind of anachronistic, right? Part of a past that the world's left behind. And one way to see that anachronistic idea here is that if it's a coal community and you're watching it on TV, it's almost automatically going to be set in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, right? That's the place at which you will see coal communities. And I would argue the implication here is that all of the good and bad things that you might see in coal communities, whether it's the kind of close-knit nature, or the kind of pride in hard work, or all of these kind of negative things, poverty, company power dominated places, their idea here is that these things are all gone, right? And so this kind of key theme in a lot of these shows and movies is that the goal is to escape them. You're supposed to escape these mining places. These are clearly places you shouldn't be or live. So let me talk a little bit about a few examples here. So I'll start with the earliest coal movies I know of. 1930s and early 40s. My thematic idea here is grand tragedy for these. And I think the first representative, and I think really the first movie I know of that's kind of like a full-fledged Hollywood movie about coal is a movie called Black Fury from 1935. It circulates, it kind of revolves around a true story about the beating and death of a coal miner in Pennsylvania coal fields, which was perpetrated by coal company's private police, right? So this is told on a true story. It's a very dark movie, especially for the 1930s, kind of a dark portrayal of class conflict, lots of company power, rough-edged community. It's a pretty amazing movie. In fact, I've read that it was banned in many communities who were worried that it was going to trigger more class conflict. Then there's a movie that I'm sure is much better known because it won a whole lot of awards, How Green Was My Valley, from 1941, which sets up a lot of other themes and kind of the other end of this scale of coal movies. It's a close-knit Welsh town. It's based on a book. There's an unsuccessful attempt at unionization that uses up time, but a few family members die, other family members escape coal mining and this horrible fate. But really, this is kind of like these noble characters are torn apart by these horrible consequences of mining. And so there's this kind of idyllic 19th century community that gets ruined here by coal mining. So it's very nostalgic, right? And there's a lot of familial drama, but also certainly a very negative portrayal of mines and mining. All right, so what happens to coal mining after that? Well, I pulled out a few more films here from the mid-1940s to the 1960s that show up, have some coal mining in them. The first one is yet another Wales-focused tale here. The Corn is Green, where we've got Miss Bette Davis. I'm trying to remember her name in the movie, but she's the school teacher. She arrives in the Welsh town in 1895. So again, look, we've moved forward in time in the movie sense, but they're still set right in the late 19th century quite often. She shows up to educate the boys who are heading in the mine, some as young as 12, we learn. And there's a lot of resistance she encounters, but she tutors one miner that she helps to escape, right? She gets him into Oxford so that his, intellectual talents don't go to waste. And he can escape this kind of rough, hard drinking mining town life. Other kinds of similar movies, very sentimental and have a lot of escape in them. The Miracle of the Bells from 1948. Now in Pennsylvania again, in a Pennsylvania coal town, this actress who's from this town goes to Hollywood, makes a movie, passes away, and her money eventually gets used to kind of help the town. So these mining towns all need to get rescued, right? Because they're bad places to live otherwise. And then there's Young Blood Hawk, which is a very quirky, curious movie in which a coal truck driver, I think I wrote diver, but he was a driver, not a diver. He writes a novel and he's able to kind of escape to a literary life in New York City, although he has kind of a weird time there too. But again, very, escape is a common theme for these movies, very sentimental. All right, then let's move into, go back here a little bit. Let's move into the 1970s and 80s. And here we're looking at controlled towns. Get rid of that screen sharing thing. It's all over me. Get rid of it. All right. So let's talk a little about controlled towns and rough edges. The movies in the 1970s and 80s in the United States in general became, especially in the 1970s, right, much more kind of gritty filmmaking during that era. And I think they're well represented in the mining movies too. So we have the 1970 movie, The Molly Maguires, very popular, famous movie where we stars Sean Connery, which portrays the real life group, the Molly Maguires, an Irish American secret society, right? And there's this idea here in the movie where they kind of gather together to fight the oppressive mine owners, but their group is going to be very clandestine, right? They use arson, sabotage, and eventually murder happens in here. So it's actually in some ways a much bleaker view of mining in general. In fact, it's one of the few movies that has a lot of mining in it, right? That people are actually doing mining, but it's also very much about the exploitation. So even though these men went to like extreme reactions, in some ways it's rather sympathetic towards them and their violent actions. There's a curious movie called Wanda from 1970 where we have kind of this dead-end life for a title character. She wanders around northern Pennsylvania coal towns. And then another more famous movie, Harlan County, USA, from 1976, a documentary that won the Academy Award about a turbulent 1973 strike. There was a new local in Harlan County, a new UMWA local that goes on strike against the Brookside Mines owners. And this focuses on kind of workers' actions against greedy owners. Again, although the workers themselves are much more heroic than in the Molly Maguires. In other words, they're portrayed as being kind of completely heroic, even though it's all about like the company power again. So again, lots of company power, very bleak portrayals here in the 1970s and 80s. All right, then let's go to the 1980s, right? Refocused into Appalachia, very kind of bleak portrayals still, but much more backward looking. So Coal Miner's Daughter, based on the autobiography of Loretta Lynn, the country singer. We've got Appalachian coal towns, again, very impoverished. They're proud people, right? And we admire the people. Yet also we're supposed to think that their ways are kind of backwards. And in fact, you never see the Kentucky town that the character's from after the main character escapes in the 1940s. So it remains kind of stuck in the past, right, in this rags to riches tale. And then another popular movie, Mattawan, although not as popular, this John Sayles movie. Again, we get kind of the plight of the workers much more emphasized here in much more of a Black Fury kind of way. We got a labor organizer who tries to join Appalachian white miners who are going on strike with the African-American and Italian-American strike breakers who show up. So it tries to get them to be in solidarity in kind of this labor movement. But, right, there's underhanded actions by the company that manages to break this out into violence. And so, we get somewhat of a nostalgic view where this is told from a narrator of a young boy's point of view of these kind of hardened people who mined in the past, but it's also still, again, much kind of bleaker, continuing some of that 1970s material. All right, now we move into the 1990s and early 2000s. I pulled out a few examples here. One's kind of Canadian, British, American production. So I'm going to count it as American because it fits in some quirky ways, called Margaret's Museum, which is actually set in Cape Breton mines, where everything gets sacrificed to the mine. It's all about mining tragedies. The main character, Margaret, her father, her older brother, her lover, all die in mine accidents. There's a very cold-hearted company, but the kind of a prideful, noble people. Movie October Sky, starring a very young Jake Gyllenhaal there in the corner of my screen. Where we have these boys. This is set a little bit later than most of these other movies, which again have almost entirely been set in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. This one's set in the kind of mid 20th century, and it's about these boys who kind of build their own rockets. They're inspired by the space age. So I'm sorry. So I think it's actually set in the 60s. I apologize. But the kind of protagonist boy's goal here is to like escape from the mines and escape mining by becoming better at science, right? And then I pulled out a quirky, funny example, Zoolander, a comedy in which you can see like how common these kind of coal mining tropes have become, because here we have this goofy male model. He's had a rough patch. He returns home to visit his family, and he works in the mine alongside his dad. And so you get the sense, right? Again, here's this guy. You're portrayed to be like a very silly male model, and kind of playing off the fact that it's a very masculine profession of mining, right? Versus this kind of urbanite kind of feminized guy who's been modeling. But the whole joke again is that they're using these ideas of like escape, right, from the mining towns, and that is and the kind of hard work of mining versus the kind of softer work outside from those who escaped, right, become very common enough they become comedic tropes. And then I'll end with these 20 teens examples here. One of which I just have spent the last 3 or 4 days binging, called When Calls the Heart. This is a Lifetime channel show, and it is very what do I want to call it? It's very elegiac. It's a romantic. It's based all in this kind of. It's a drama, but it's very all about the romance between the various characters, as are many Lifetime movies and shows. It again, you can see it starts to contain all the different tropes that I've talked about through all of these different kinds of mining movies. where you bury a little bit of some of the kind of labor focus, right, of the kind of hard the in a lot of the others, but there's still a lot of dirt. There's still a lot of disaster. The show starts where there's a disaster, a mine disaster that killed half the men. I think 46 men of the town called Coal Valley. And so the first season and a half are all about the struggles against this mining company that owns the whole town. And in one episode, widows save their houses, in fact, by cleaning out all the rocks that had fallen down. Like they're supposed to get evicted from their homes, right? Now that their husbands are no longer employed, right, because they died. But instead, right, to fight off the company, they go in and clear out the shafts, and they sign this whole contract that if they clean out the tunnels, then surely they should be allowed to keep their homes. The young teacher who's in the center picture here essentially helps to save a lot of the young people of this town by educating them. And in fact, all the smartest ones she picks out and says something about how, they really need to, get a better education so that they can head out of town, right? So again, very similar to these other movies, right, where the whole goal in some ways is to leave the town. In the second season, the mining company gets taken down in court for violating safety standards, right? They prove that it had been cutting corners to save costs, and that's why this mine disaster happened. So they closed the mine and hilariously renamed the town of Coal Valley to Hope Valley. And I say this is hilarious because I actually live right next door to a town that is called Coal Valley here in Illinois. So I'm going to go right over after this and tell them they need to rename their town to Hope Valley. And then the last show I wanted to talk about very briefly is a show called Justified that was kind of running at the same time as When Calls the Heart, which is still on. You can still catch it on Lifetime. I think it's the one outlier. In some ways, it's kind of the outlier that proves the rule, right? It's modern. It's based in Harlan County, right? This coal mining area. And yet, right, and in fact, it starts off with the two main characters, which one's a lawman, right, and one is this kind of rather evil leader of a gang. Apparently knew each other because they grew up mining, right? But they've since escaped mining, moved on to bigger, in some ways, worse things, right? But there's almost no mining in the show, and even though it's kind of set in this modern Harlan County, there's certainly still some themes about company power and violence, but it's much less of a mining movie. So it's a very modern, much less of a mining show, but it's a very modern take. And again, is slightly outside those bounds. So let me just kind of conclude by kind of pointing out some of the themes here, right? So again, right, in general, in all these shows, very noble, kind of proud inhabitants of coal communities, right? So these are not like portrayed almost in any of these cases as kind of, backwards hillbillies. The coal communities themselves, though, are certainly suggested, right, to be kind of bad places to live, right? They're impoverished. They're driven by guys fighting with each other. They're overridden by company power. So even in the most kind of romantic, elegiac things like When Calls the Heart, right, the company power, right, is the most important theme, right, in some ways, right? That's the villain they're always fighting. And yet, right, they're also very anachronistic, right? So number one, right, you're going to be in the late 19th or early 20th century. And all of these different things that they kind of point out as being representative of coal communities are not there in the modern world. And so I think especially this theme that you keep seeing over and over again, that all these main characters are trying to escape or that others are trying to help them escape these communities, certainly suggests that you shouldn't be living in these coal places, right? They're interesting places to base your show and your work, but they're also, part of this past that we've thankfully left behind, I think, in a lot of their views. So I'm going to stop there and just let you guys chat and ask questions, and I'm happy to talk about lots of other kinds of mining things I have seen or listened to or played. Oh yeah, there's a few good messages here. I'm now reading the mark. Yeah, how green is my belly? I've actually never read the book, Johnny. I'm sorry to admit that. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that. Although I did read recently, I was Googling things about how green was my valley, and apparently, like, the guy who wrote this book, they later found out he actually didn't grow up in this place or something like that. Like, he's actually not. Do you know more about that?
Well, I remember that too. When I went to last year with Bob Walensky, the trip to Scotland and Wales, all the coal mines,
Yeah.
all very strong Welsh thing. We spent 4 days in Cardiff and saw that stuff. And so they said, you got to read that book. So I read it, but I read it and then we watched the movie, and you could see the difference. But yeah, I remember reading about the author about, because it sounded like it had to have been, but it was a composite story, I think.
Yeah. It's like apparently not really his true, like all of his own true tale of his own personal life. So apparently people got very upset at him. But it does seem to be fairly
so
true.
Written because you think it was, which means a really good author to write something that would seem like it's autobiographical when he's actually writing a historical fiction or fiction.
Yeah, and then I see also a good point on October Sky. Yeah, almost entirely true. In fact, I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head right now of the book, right? It was based on this guy's, I think actually he wrote originally, it was like an article or something, right? That's based on, but he actually, they kind of wrote up one script and sent it to him. And he actually was very upset at the portrayals at that point of the mining community, and they pulled back and tried to make it much more kind of real life. I think it's actually, I think it's quite a good movie, and it's certainly fairly fair to the people involved.
Yeah, I saw that one in the theater. Like when you look back and you actually saw that one in a theater, so that says something, because a lot of the other ones, how many of them did people see in a theater, or just they saw them, but eventually they were able to get a DVD or stream?
Oh yeah,
I had to buy a VHS to show the Molly Maguires at the Scranton conference. I still have the VHS and no way to watch it.
Right, but yeah, is it Homer Hickam? Is that right?
Homer Hickam.
Thank you.
Yeah. Brian, I was going to say that Al Green was my Valley, a 1941 film, wasn't it? 1941. Yeah. The underground footage, or the footage purportedly underground of the mine disaster, I think, is probably one of the most realistic portrayals of an underground environment I've ever seen in any movie. It's pretty remarkable. Today's world of special effects and CGI, I don't think anybody's done better.
Yeah, it's really impressive.
And terrifying.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I believe I have to go back and look, but I believe they went into some mines to do some of the filming, but I don't know if they did that scene in the mine though. But I'd be interested to know.
I was just by coincidence looking at the area where October Sky or Rocket Boys took place, and it was, as Johnny's mentioned in the chat here, it is a true story with some adaptation, but pretty close to it. And I didn't realize that Homer Hickam actually wrote 3 books.
Yeah,
October Sky being, I guess, the middle of the story. There's a sort of like a prequel and a sequel, I guess. But so I'm going to go back and look at those. But I did discover one thing. I expected to see something about a reunion at Coalwood, which is where Homer Hickam grew up and where the mine was. And apparently it is a victim of either total lack of interest or COVID or both, because they moved the town festival from Coalwood to Beckley, which has, of course, a coal museum and a mine you can go into and things. But it got canceled this year because of, I guess it appears, lack of interest. The other thing that I noticed in looking at a lot of these little old coal mining towns was that, of course, many of them were down at the hills quite a long time ago. So the old timers are sort of dying off. There's an immense number of coal memorials in towns that hardly exist anymore, and they're very, very interesting. I was looking to see on the memorial in Dant, Virginia. And Dant, Virginia was the corporate headquarters of Clinchfield Coal, which was a major coal company for a long time in Virginia. And pretty much the core of the town has been demolished. There's one building there. I think it may have been the office building, but across the street, the company store was torn down. These are pretty modern buildings. I was actually there in the late 60s, and But they have as of about a year ago, a very nice miners memorial. And of course, it memorializes the fact that they had a mine explosion that killed 6 workers. Steve, I was looking to find how to drive to Portal 31, which is over in Kentucky, and Steve has been very active in that. And then as I looked down, I found 2 other interesting sort of memorial things and cemetery things in northeastern Tennessee. There are 2 towns within a short distance of one another that both have had serious mine disasters, one with 184 men getting killed and another one with definitely double digits. And they were in their town cemeteries. They have what are called miners' circles, which is a centerpiece with concentric circles of graves. The centerpiece being a UMWA supplied kind of obelisk. Very, very interesting. Both of them were nominated for the National Historic Register. So there's a lot of documentation on them. But yeah, it's an interesting part of Virginia, Kentucky, West Virginia, down there in that nexus of the 3 states. So I'm hoping we get down there to see it one of these days.
Yeah,
Hey,
I think
Mike.
Hey, Steve.
Well, Brian, excellent presentation. And Mike, I remember your email about cemeteries in coal camps, and I haven't forgotten that. I've been keeping my eyes open. I've got a few thoughts for you on that. But
Good.
Anyway, for those of you who haven't been real active in MHA yet, but was at the conference in Alabama last year. I live in Lexington, Kentucky now, but grew up in Appalachia. And Brian, we pronounce it Appalachia down here. But I lived in East Kentucky and East Tennessee for many years, and I've worked there most of my career. But interestingly enough, thank you for mentioning Portal 31, Mike. We led a bus tour to Portal 31 Saturday to go to Harlan County, and we got out of Harlan County alive. If Brian, you'll recognize that from Justified.
Yeah.
The song "You'll Never Leave Harlan Alive." But Portal 31 is an exhibition mine, and I just got through leading a project, upgrading it, spending a $2.5 million grant to upgrade all the facilities. It's now a Disney-esque type exhibition mine with animated exhibits telling the story of mining history from 1917, when U.S. Steel started the mines, up through modern times. And those of you who don't recognize the name Lynch, Kentucky, it is purportedly the largest coal camp ever built, with a population of almost 11,000 in its heyday. Mostly immigrant miners and African-American miners brought up from Alabama and Georgia. So perhaps we'll get an opportunity for MHA to make a field trip there one of these days. So a couple other interesting points. You mentioned Youngblood Hawk. I lived in Jenkins when I worked for Bethlehem Steel, and I believe part of Youngblood Hawk was filmed in Jenkins, Kentucky.
Yeah, I believe you're right. Mm-hmm.
And you all mentioned October Sky. That was a great movie. And Homer Hickam also wrote a number of books. He then went from coal country, from inner space to outer space. He wrote a number of science fiction novels, which I've read, I think, everything he's written. But Justified is one of our favorite shows. In fact, there's a new season of Justified, but instead of Kentucky setting, he's now in Detroit. So it's currently airing. But good to see everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah. "You'll Never Leave Harlan Alive" is one of my favorite songs. In fact, at one point, I gave a presentation about mining songs, and I think I featured it. As I recall, the songwriter, it's Daryl Scott who wrote it, and I think his grandfather was a Harlan County miner, and so it's kind of about him trying to learn more about his grandfather.
Yeah,
Brian, Homer Hickam's book, I think it's Sky of Stone, is rather distinctly different from the rest in that it focuses on his conflict with his father, a longtime miner, who was
Mhm.
convinced that Homer would never be anything more than a miner, and it was the best life for him, and essentially forced him to take a job in the mines, which Homer resisted, didn't like. But the focus of the plot is that Homer was engaged with his crew in a competition with another crew as to who could lay, I think, most track and adrift in a given period of time. And he becomes very tightly bonded to his crew and kind of learns about the nobility of the miner in that context. So it's distinctly different than the other titles, and worth a read.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I've never read it. Although it is interesting because they, yeah, part of the conflict with his father, right, is embedded in the October Sky movie, and there's a little bit of that. It was like they tried to shove, as far as I understand, they tried to shove a bunch of different things together. I think, like I said, as I recall, I might have to go back and look this up again. I recall, like, originally, I think Hickam wrote a short story or something like that that had a lot of different things in it, which is what they had originally thought was going to base the movie on, and then kind of turn it into a whole series of books. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to compare them all and see what happens.
He did actually have a pretty good career at NASA, and before then he switched out to being a writer.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I think he retired from NASA.
Yep.
Oh, one other mention, the Justified series was based on short stories by Elmore Leonard, who is most well known for his Westerns, but he wrote a series. And also the movie Get Shorty and several other films that were based on his novels. But Homer's, I suggest reading his books, all of them. I like his science fiction as well.
Yeah, I think Elmer Leonard. Well, when they were making that show, the idea was like we're going to do a neo western, right, in a totally different spot.
Brian,
yeah.
speaking of science fiction, I don't know if you got it, but I sent you a coal mining movie in the science fiction context out of the, oh golly, it was either late 50s or early 60s from Japan. And I don't know if it predated Godzilla or not, but the movie was called Rodan, where a group of Japanese coal miners in the process of doing their everyday mining mine into a huge chamber that contains this prehistoric creature which escapes and terrorizes Japan. It's actually kind of a clever movie, and it's available online for free viewing. So if you get a chance and you want to laugh, kind of enjoy something, it's subtitled Rodan, Rodan, and it's coal mining through and through.
That's really funny.
And that reminds me of another movie, Brian, you might want to check out. It was called Fire Down Below, and it was the precursor to Justified, based on Elmore Leonard. But it starred Steven Seagal, and it was actually filmed in Kentucky in the coal fields. And I remember getting a call from the Kentucky Film Commission and say, "Can you find us a coal mine we can blow up?" But Steven Seagal came to Kentucky with his entourage, and they had to find a horse farm in Lexington in the bluegrass area for him to stay at. And then they helicoptered him down to the hazard area where they filmed a lot of the movie. But he brought his entourage of 20 people, including his spiritual advisor, his chef, bodyguards, his children, and his babysitter, who was also pregnant with his child. And they were riding around eastern Kentucky one day in his armored SUV, and he saw a little old guy sitting on the side of the road carving and selling his woodwork. And he said, "Hey, pull over. I want to buy a souvenir." So he walks up to this little guy in his overalls, chewing tobacco, sitting on his stool, whittling. And he said, "Hey, let me buy some souvenirs here." And the little guy looked up at him and nodded. Steven Seagal says, "Well, you don't know who I am, do you?" Of course, he has his long ponytail and his Hollywood clothes on, and little guy on the stool looks up at him and said, "No, who was your daddy?" Which that's a typical saying in East Kentucky. We always want to know, who's your daddy? But that's another one to look at. It actually has some a lot of scenery out of the East Kentucky coal fields.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. It's funny. I have watched that movie, but a long time ago, and clearly need to include it.
Yeah, it was also based on the Elmore Leonard story that Justified was later based on.
Yeah, it's funny. Mark's comment also made me think of another kind of creature feature in a similar vein to Rodin, something called the Black Scorpion from 1950s, like 57 or something like that, where which as far as I can tell seems to be the first occurrence on film of the use of a fake canary to analyze the air down below. They go to Mexico and they're trying to figure out if it's dangerous where they have these massive scorpions and other insects that have that are now the size of buildings going around getting them. And I found it very funny that they brought a canary down with them, like that was going to warn them about the massive scorpion that's the size of 15 buses.
I guess another category of movie, and I can't even think of a good example right now, but would be sort of documentaries that are, maybe a little more based on reality than some of the fictional stuff that we've seen in movies. Do you have any thoughts on those, Brian?
That's a good question. I mean, I kind of purposely left them out, other than at least briefly mentioning Harlan County, USA, since it had a fairly large cultural impact, and I think in some ways that influenced more of the popular filmmaking after it. You're right. I mean, there's a fair number of them. I guess I don't have amazingly brilliant thoughts about all of them, other than to say that I think there's two versions of them. The ones that I've seen most recently have been very, they're kind of like out and out in some ways. Actually, many of them are maybe even more negative about coal mining and coal mining communities, and especially companies, at least the ones that I'm thinking of right now, than even a lot of the popular films, in the sense that a lot of them kind of end up being talking heads telling you about how horrific X or Y thing is, whether it's a mine disaster or coming environmental collapse. But you often don't necessarily get kind of these in-depth character portrayals of the people involved, so you don't necessarily get to know the people and places all that well amidst it. But yeah, I'd be interested to know if people have other impressions of a lot of those coal mining, because you're right, there's a fair number of coal mining documentaries, and they run the gamut. They certainly get much more modern, right, in the sense that I could say I've certainly watched maybe 2 or 3 in the last year that were about coal mining in Appalachia, but were about mountaintop removal mining, right? That was they were kind of like activist documentaries. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested if there's some good ones, if other people have other thoughts, or if there's good ones to watch.
A lot of documentaries end up being on the short side, because they're usually disasters.
Yep.
They might someone Ludlow, but you got all those coal mining disasters and the Knox mine flood and all those kind of things. So it's hard to make them into a feature-length film, because you need a hero and a survivor, and you need that kind of. And when hundreds of people died in tragedy, and when you see the real, the Avondale disaster, I mean, you see in Leslie's or the different magazine articles and the accounts of the time, it's very morbid to try and think about making a popular movie out of that. Or think about the ones where you have 1 or 2 survivors. And I guess you could do it with the Creek rescue or things like that. You could probably you could certainly documentaries, and then make a feature film on it if you had people and characters and a narrative. But it also tends to be very slow moving. you're waiting to be rescued. It just takes
Right.
a long time. There's really not much action. It's a lot of inaction, and finally you figure a way out or somehow your thing, but the plot's pretty slow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there
I
have been, just this last year, there have been a couple of documentaries that are not particularly mining related, but they dealt with convict leasing in the coal industry and the iron industry and other forest products industries in the South in the post-Civil War period. And of course, in fact, one of these towns that I mentioned in one of these miners' circles is in East Tennessee. Their big labor unrest there was the fact that they brought in, the mining companies brought in leased convicts to work in the mines, and that led to an effort to unionize the mines, and it was largely Italian miners in the town. But that, until the Birmingham meeting, I really had never paid any attention to the convict leasing in the mining industry, and it obviously was an important thing. And I think Alabama was probably the last state to outlaw it. But that's sort of a black spot in mining history.
Brian,
Yeah.
just to shift gears real quickly away from documentaries, I just thought of a TV series that was probably running 8 to 10 years ago, a reality series, very similar to the Gold Rush format type of thing, but it was a small Appalachian coal company. It probably had 8 or 10 episodes total. Eventually, I think they shut down, and that was part of the drama that they shut down. But it was pretty well produced and quite realistic as it went. I don't think it was perhaps as choreographed as Gold Rush seems to be. It seemed to be pretty straightforward, but it was in that reality series format. And I don't know if anybody remembers that.
Called
Hey,
Coal,
Mark, yeah,
Coal
that's
TV.
Yeah, coal. And it was actually
Yeah.
filmed near Coalwood, West Virginia. I'd forgotten
was it?
about that one too. I drove by there. I went, took a trek to Coalwood one time and then drove up by the old mine site. Of course, it's no longer there, but I think MSHA shut them down. Like,
Yeah, I think you're right. It's those of you on this call who were at the Fairbanks Mining History Association meeting, there's a gal, Tatiana, I think her name's Soviak, actually gave a presentation that part of it was about that coal show, which I think was how I ended up finding out about it. And I remember part of her presentation was about this you're talking about some of the production, how produced these are. The parts that I remember standing out to me, like they bought like white teeth veneers to put on all the miner guys. And then they bought them all like these fancy like new Ford pickup trucks, partly for the product placement, to drive them on and off the place. So it's funny because I agree. Like I think some of the it actually in some ways feels much more real than a lot of those other those shows. But I think there's clearly a lot of production going on behind the scenes and all those.
back to documentaries, a young mining engineer I met with yesterday was telling me about one that's coming out called King Coal, which is set in West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't even watched the trailer yet, but it's supposedly an hour, 23-minute documentary that talks about growing up in the coal fields and all the modern issues. So I'm going to check that one out. So might put that on your radar.
Yeah, thanks. That's good. Great.
Okay, any other comments? Suggested media? Anything? Thank you very much, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for
Very good.
listening.